Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Danny Lamb. I'm a program manager for program development and outreach in the Office of Research and Innovation here at the University of Texas at Dallas, and I am serving as your moderator today for Aretha. So please allow me to introduce today's presenters. First, we have Connor Wakeman. Connor is the Director for Ethics and International Research here at UT Dallas. In this role, Connor leads key institutional compliance programs covering conflicts of interest and commitment, export and research data compliance, visiting scholars, academic research security, and of course, much more. Connor joined the Office of Research and Innovation at UTD in 2011 as a research compliance coordinator and has served in progressive leadership roles for the institution's research integrity program over the past 12 years. Also joining us and presenting today is Vangeline Garcia. She currently serves as the Assistant Director for Research Security within the Office of Research and Innovation here at UTD. Prior to this position, Vangeline assisted researchers by providing comprehensive data management services and consultation. We are lucky to have you both here today presenting, and I will throw it to you, Connor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Danny, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us here today. And anyone who is watching this recording later, thank you for taking a look at this recording. The purpose of this video and of today's presentation is to provide an introduction to controlled unclassified information, and we are going to touch on really two main topics. The first is we're going to give a very brief introduction to what is controlled unclassified information, or CUI, as I'll refer to it for the rest of this presentation. And then we're going to provide an introduction to the process that the Office of Research uses to identify, assess, and manage controlled unclassified information that is received by UT Dallas or generated by UT Dallas as part of a federal research contract. And so we're going to walk through the process diagram that we have, starting from pre-proposal, going through award performance for projects that have CUI compliance obligations involved. So to get started, so what is CUI? So CUI is a federal information security policy that focuses on preserving the confidentiality of information the government has identified as sensitive. So it is a step between what we in the academic world call fundamental research and the classified research program. And it meets a need for the federal government to provide confidentiality obligations as well as security requirements for maintaining the confidentiality of this information, for information that requires safeguarding, but does not need to be subject to classified information or research security protocols. And so we interact with things deemed as CUI on a regular basis, but we just don't have to secure or safeguard that information in compliance with the federal government's standards for the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that information. So examples of CUI from the government's perspective is things like your personally identifiable information. So when you give that to a government agency, right, they would consider that CUI. One area that we interact with is called covered defense information. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, which is DoD, the Department of Defense, identifies certain kinds of information that are critical or sensitive to their operations or their technology development. And so then to them, right, that is information that requires this additional level of safeguarding, as well as export controlled research. So research subject to national security controls. Again, it's unclassified, but has national security controls on it. And then critical infrastructure information. So these are all kinds of information that have an underlying regulation that says this information is important to the US government and requires access authorizations, requires use authorizations, may have other kinds of requirements on it. But at the end of the day, there is a confidentiality obligation. And so when we have a contract from the federal government, and sometimes we don't get grants, we get contracts, and they identify that as part of this contract, you will or may have access to controlled unclassified information, then we are entering a situation which we have to be aware of whether we're receiving that information, and then we may have to protect that controlled unclassified information as if we were a federal agency, because we are working on behalf of a federal agency. So we work with a lot of information inside the university that is that is a category of CUI, but we don't have to secure it as if it was TUI. And so I'm kind of get into that with this Foursquare. So this is kind of a brief introduction to the big ideas of the CUI program at UTD. So we need to comply with CUI requirements when a funding agency tells us to. So it will come down in a contract, and it will spell out in that contract that as part of this, you have to meet the security requirements and implement the security controls necessary for CUI. And those security controls really focus on, again, like I said, the confidentiality and integrity of this information that the government has identified, that the sponsor has identified as controlled and classified information. And so right now we are seeing CUI contractual requirements come to UT Dallas researchers from two primary agencies, the Department of Defense and then NASA. So researchers submitting funding proposals to those two agencies are at a higher likelihood of having controlled and classified information requirements put into their contract, and thus be part of their performance of that contract. In terms of, so what those policies say is just here are these agencies' approach to CUI. There are two other policies that specify what the actual security requirements that you have to follow are. And so I mentioned them not because we're going to get into what these policies say, but just because we may talk about them. And then we may talk about them later, if you have a contract we review with you. And so we just want to put these policy names out into the universe so that you're aware that, hey, this is a CUI related policy. So the most important one is called NIST 800-171. And so this is a policy that really dives deep into what are the specific physical as well as digital security controls that need to be implemented by an organization to secure CUI. And it focuses mostly on the system infrastructure that is used and then the personnel processes around the use of that infrastructure in which the CUI is stored. And so part of our office's role is to go through all of those controls and make sure they're implemented and tested in compliance with NIST 800-171. And then if you're a Department of Defense funded researcher and you hear someone mention CMMC, CMMC is the DoD's NIST 800-171 program. So it has its own name. We know agencies love to come up with acronyms and provide names for things that are essentially the same, but CMMC level 2 is DoD's NIST 800-171 program. So those two policies will apply to researchers and the projects that are working with controlled and classified information. So how do we comply with these regulations? The primary tool is something that the NIST policy calls a system security plan. And so that is a plan which identifies all of the controls that need to be implemented. They do a good job of identifying all of that for us, but then we have to go through each one and make sure that it is being followed. So our office will guide you through that. And then in particular what the system security plan is targeted at, again, is what is the storage and computing solution you're using to secure this information that you're receiving or generating that is deemed CUI. And so that is an important part of the process, is identifying a NIST compliant storage and computing solution to store this information. And so then who ends up being involved in these efforts where we have to navigate the CUI compliance obligations? So, our team is the lead for the institution in terms of identifying, evaluating, and then implementing the controls necessary for the project. But we also work closely with information security because they provide monitoring, oversight and governance support for these kinds of projects, and then information technology, both at the central level and at the department or unit level, because depending on the storage solution that is used, they will likely be involved in the implementation of that infrastructure. So now we're going to move into our process description. And so what we're doing here is really getting into the weeds in terms of providing you a look at how CUI can become relevant at each step of the federal funded research proposal and award process. And so we want to just point out, okay, as you're working through the process of, identifying, developing, submitting, and performing a federally funded research project, what can you do to be prepared for CUI obligations or to work with the Office of Research to identify and manage those obligations at each step of the proposal process, because CUI does come up as you go through this process. So the way that this table works is we are pointing out things that researchers can do. We also mentioned, okay, for that specific task, who would be your point of contact within the Office of Research? For the purposes of the presentation today, we really just have two offices who will be your primary points of contact: sponsor projects or our team, the Research Security and Ethics team. And then there are a few items on this table, which we will post on our website, where there are links to forms, which you can or will need to submit as part of this process. And so you're able to click on the link and it will take you to the form that is relevant to that particular task. So for pre-proposal stage, right, in what we're talking about is you're looking around, you're trying to identify new funding opportunities from the federal government. You've identified your specialist. Hey, I'm interested in this. And if you see, one of these policies, if you see CUI, if you see NIST 171, mentioned in one of these RFPs that you're reviewing or BAAs that you're reviewing, what can you do to start preparing for the possibility that CUI would be part of this project performance? So one element that you can do, which will help to prepare for having to implement system security plans and what we call later a technology control plan, is to document or collect your documentation for how your lab operates and manages the data security for the projects that you're already performing. So being aware of how your team handles, for instance, collaboration requests, how you identify the onboarding for new researchers, for new project personnel, how you deal with segmenting project access between different teams, depending on who needs to have access to what data. So understanding what you already do for these projects will help us later if we do have to write and implement security plans for a CUI project. Another item you can do is just learn more about CUI. You can reach out to us. We can provide you with information from the funding agencies where they talk about CUI. We can also have a one-on-one session and just go over, okay, what could CUI look like for you and your lab? What are the implications? What are the costs? And just give you some insight into specifically what the impact would be on your lab for managing CUI obligations as part of a research project. Once you identify a proposal you'd like to submit, follow standard OSP procedures in terms of developing your statement of work and budget, submitting the proposal certification. Two items that I would like to point out that are more important, especially on the Department of Defense side, for projects that may involve CUI obligations, is in the budget, including specifically line items for IT infrastructure and services, because the solutions that are available for managing CUI do come at an additional cost, and there is additional time and effort that is required to implement the documentation and then follow the controls and manage these obligations. So we are recommending including in the budget costs for those expenses for those services. The second thing I want to point out is just that these projects are considered higher impact to the Department of Defense, both because there is the confidentiality obligation, which is a compliance risk, but also because generally they are identifying CUI obligations for academic and classified funded research when those projects are investigating a topic that is deemed critical or emerging to the Department of Defense. And that critical and emerging technology designation is because the Department of Defense sees value either to the Department of Defense itself or to the United States economic or technological interests. And so they take a higher level of interest in the current and pending other support information in the outside affiliations of the researchers who are performing on these teams. So really make sure that your current and pending other support documentation and your CV is complete and accurate whenever you're proposing for one of these projects, because it is more than likely that DoD will go through those documents with a fine-tooth comb to identify any risks that they would deem to the project from the research team's external affiliations or funding. If you have questions about those kinds of scenarios, we are also the team that provides guidance to researchers on that side. That's from our ethics and COI side, and so we're happy to have a separate or include in a COI meeting talking about the conflict of interest implications of your external funding and affiliations. In terms of developing the proposal, we also see that in particular for DoD, they will request information about the foreign nationals being assigned to the project. This is a standard practice. This doesn't mean that they will be excluded, but there is a higher likelihood that there will be foreign national restrictions on a project like this. If you have questions about providing that information or what it may mean, we're happy to help meet that obligation as well. We also complete CUI compliance certifications for the funding agencies. Our team takes the lead on completing those certifications, but we may have to ask for information from you, the PI, as part of completing those certifications. And then lastly, for some of these funding agencies at proposal stage, they do ask that we provide a written fundamental research justification. And so what that means is that they want us to show our work as to why we believe that this project is fundamental research. And so we will reach out to you and ask for information after reviewing your statement of work to identify whether the resulting information and software that comes out of your project will meet the definitions to meet the criteria to qualify as fundamental research. And that way, then what we would actually do is what I'll talk about in a minute is we would avoid CUI obligations and CUI compliance altogether. And so that is if you do not want to, if you want to apply to these agencies and not have to deal with controlled and classified information compliance, then scoping the project to meet the fundamental research criteria can be an important part of the proposal development because there may be certain decisions about the scope of the project, the intended outcomes of the project that will need to be made in order to ensure that you do meet the fundamental research justification. Okay, so I did see that there was a question in the chat. I'm just going to peek at it real quick just to see.
Yeah, I can go ahead and read it to you, Connor. It's from Dr. Gassensmith, and his question is, he's been working on a team at DTRA, and the CUI requirements include not even being able to publish. Will UTD accept funding with a CUI condition that limits publishing? Also, he notes that he's already ruled this out and will not pursue a project that does not allow publishing, but for his own curiosity, what is UTD's position on this?
Oh, okay. Well, that is a nice segue, actually, to the next stage. So we just talked about pre-proposal, proposal, and so this comes up at award. And so now I'm going to talk briefly about the award negotiation phase and where CUI comes in terms of award negotiation. And then I'm going to hand things off to Evangeline to talk about when you accept a CUI obligation, what is the process for developing the security plans and going through into award performance. So at award negotiation, we end up with a decision. We end up with a bifurcated path. So at award negotiation, one common route is we negotiate out the CUI obligations. And so in doing that, we make an argument that what we're doing is fundamental research, and thus the CUI compliance obligations do not apply to our project. And so in that way, then none of the rest of what we're going to talk about would apply to you, right? Because you would not have to write system security plans, technology control plans, because the definition of controlled unclassified information, particularly in the Department of Defense policy, says that fundamental research does not involve controlled unclassified information. And vice versa, controlled unclassified information doesn't apply to the results of fundamental research. So if we're able to get the fundamental research waiver from these national security requirements that trigger these CUI compliance obligations, then what that means is we made an argument that what we're doing is fundamental research, and so they do not apply. If we do not, if we are, and the way we do that is we review the statement of work with you, and we look for that your project is generating scientific experimental data and results that are typical to the performance of academic research. Where things can become harder to make the fundamental research justification is if you're delivering a specific product, such as like a software package, a prototype, like material samples, like physical items, and then associated technology related to the processes you used, to the source code. If you're delivering those kinds of items that can be used to the sponsor, then we have a much more difficult time making that fundamental research justification, because the fundamental research waiver just applies to information and software that is published, right? So if you're generating things that you're not going to publish, or you're generating physical items that can be used, then that means we're not engaged in fundamental research as it's defined for the purposes of performing the Department of Defense research for the purposes of export control regulations. So if either we agree with you that, hey, we're not performing fundamental research, we can accept these obligations, or we make an argument to the sponsor and they say, you know what, sorry, like we don't agree. We think what you're doing is not fundamental, and thus you do need to comply with these controls. Then we would come back to you and say, look, okay, do you agree? Do you want to perform a project with these security requirements? And then we get your consent, right? And if you consent and say, yes, I'm willing to do this, then we initiate the process that Vangelina is going to talk more about, where we do implement the necessary controls to perform the project in compliance with these, with the CUI policies, with the NIST policy, and with either the DoD or NASA policy. So, but your question, the question that was raised in the chat is slightly different than what I just said. And so I want to kind of answer that specifically, which is, so the answer is that, yes, most often we see it's called the Disclosure of Information Clause from the Department of Defense on all of the information and results that are generated by the project, which means that we are not free to publish the resulting data and information that is funded by that project without going through the sponsor's publication approval process. And so that is one of the requirements that then signals or creates a CUI compliance obligation. And I say it that way because, like, there are sometimes we have projects that have this kind of publication approval process but don't involve CUI. But almost always when we have a CUI project, at least from DoD, they also impose those publication approval requirements. We can try to negotiate out the publication approval requirement and then talk to them about, okay, what is it that you want us to do with the CUI? So it could be, for instance, that there is some kind of reference document that they want to share with us that they deem as CUI, but it won't be we won't study or further develop the information that's contained in that project. And so it is possible but unlikely that we could remove or water down the publication approval requirements because the scope of the CUI is very narrow, and in that way could engage in a project that is more academic friendly but use CUI as a reference or a frame for performing the project. It has that doesn't happen very often, but it's possible. So I'm happy to, if there is a specific proposal, or if there are more details from a funding agency, that are related to this kind of question, we are happy to and encourage researchers to come to us and ask for additional guidance. And we can talk directly to the sponsor to kind of understand what it is that what is their goal, like what are they trying to do, what is the role of the CUI in the project. One possibility could be using two different contracts, using an NDA to share the CUI and then perform the project under a separate contract. maybe that would allow us to make this kind of distinction between the funded work and this controlled classified information. But unfortunately, there is no standard approach right now for these kinds of questions. You really just have to figure out and have a discussion with each sponsor about how they want to handle these questions. So to get back to the course of the presentation, we were in the context here, we're unable to negotiate out the CUI, and you, the PI, say, yes, I am willing to manage CUI compliance obligations as part of performing this project. And so then at that point, I would hand you off to my esteemed colleague, Vangeline Garcia, and she's now going to talk us through what happens once you say, yes, I'm willing to manage CUI as part of a federally funded research project.
Thank you, Connor. So as he stated, that was a nice segue. When it's clear that a contract will be accepted with CUI obligations, my office will evaluate the statement of work and communicate with you and with the sponsor to identify the CUI that will be a part of the project, to identify the CUI category. It's important to note that it's possible that not all outputs of the project will be CUI. So part of the process that we undertake is to identify what will be CUI and what won't be CUI, so that it's safe, so that each is safeguarded accordingly. So once that's established, we identify a CUI storage environment. So we work with you to identify, and campus partners, to identify an appropriate storage environment. And then we develop a NIST system security plan, which Connor has mentioned earlier. So this NIST system security plan we develop. It's not something that the PI will be responsible for developing. And we develop this plan in partnership with campus partners to document all of the security controls that are required to comply with the NIST 800-171 security requirements. And so there are times where we may reach out to you for input, but for the most part, the SSP is something that we will develop. Now, the plan that the PI will be responsible for is called the Technology Control Plan. And so we have various templates that we would share with you, but the Technology Control Plan, the purpose of it is for you to outline how you will use this secure infrastructure, how you will manage the personnel throughout the project, what policies or processes or procedures your lab will undertake and follow to secure and to safeguard the CUI and other information that will be a part of your project. And so to summarize, the SSP, it's a plan that's dedicated to document how the infrastructure complies with security requirements. And this TCP is a document that outlines how you as the PI will safeguard, how you will use the infrastructure, how you will manage your personnel throughout the project. Okay, so once the plans have been created, a CUI storage environment has been identified, the award has completed negotiating, we move on to the award performance stage. So at this stage, it is very important for all project personnel to complete CUI training. And so before any CUI is accessed or before the storage environment begins to be used, all project personnel must undergo CUI training. At the award performance stage, there are several high-level tasks. So I will go through them, but besides the CUI training, there's no particular order that some of these tasks have to occur. So the CUI training, it's completed. Now personnel can be onboarded into the project, into the CUI storage resource. And now you just continue complying with the system security plan, the technology control plan. Both of these plans can have iterations, so they can both be updated and versioned. For the technology control plan, we really encourage that, for example, if there's any personnel changes, so if someone leaves or if you add someone to your lab, it's very important that you update that in the technology control plan. If you have any procedures or any processes that have changed, for example, let's say your lab moves, all those kinds of things you want to reflect in an updated technology control plan. And similarly with the SSP, if for whatever reason, the infrastructure has to change or something has to be updated, etc., we would also work with you and other campus partners to update the SSP. But the TCP is primarily something that you will be responsible for managing and updating. So the next task here is marking CUI documents. So the CUI training will walk you through what that means, what it looks like to mark a document, when to mark a document. So it's important that as you perform the project that you indeed mark the documents that are CUI, because this is one significant measure that you take to safeguard CUI is by labeling it as such. And then throughout the award performance, you continue to manage personnel. So onboarding, something I've already mentioned, offboarding, which is particularly important, making sure that you remove people's access once they're no longer a part of the project, to the storage environment, to any other resources or information that are part of the project that they shouldn't have access to. And then continuing ongoing training, continue monitoring access, etc. Another thing to do is reporting any cyber incidents or any breaches, any misconduct, any safety incidents as they come. And reporting is not something that you will be get in trouble for. It's very important to report these things, not only for UTD information security policies, but also to comply with the NIST 800-171 controls as well. So these are some of the high-level things that you do during award performance if you are to accept the CUI project.
Thank you, Evangeline, for that overview. As you can, as you've heard, there are quite a few things that go into the life cycle of performing and managing a research project involving controlled unclassified information. I just want to take a moment to kind of emphasize the reporting aspect of these projects. Like, this is really a big point of emphasis for the DoD and for the NIST policy, is that suspected or potential breaches of the security protocols, especially the cybersecurity protocols of the SSP, require very quick and detailed reporting, and then we have additional reporting to the DoD, and so that is spelled out clearly in the system security plan, what we need to do, and then the specific behaviors expected of the project personnel are spelled out in the technology control plan. And so that is something that DoD and our other federal partners have really emphasized to us is if there is a suspected breach, especially an external breach, we are the victim there. And so we should not hesitate to report those things, because their goal, one, is to safeguard and limit the damage and potential exposure of the CUI, and then to help and support us, right? As opposed to when we make a report like that, we are automatically assumed to be guilty of, some kind of violation. So, I just want to kind of like dive into that topic a little bit deeper, because I know that's a sensitive one, but it's also one that is a really important to this program. The last obligation I want to mention is something that becomes a kind of shared obligation between sponsored projects and my team. And then we may ask for information from your team, which is that as part of performing these projects, there is often additional documents and reports that have to be submitted throughout the lifetime of the project concerning our efforts, concerning the SSP development, concerning other IT decisions and award performance milestones that are met. And so, we will help to identify and ensure that those reports are completed and submitted to the sponsor as part of performing the project. So this is our overview of the process. Certainly there are nuances and changes and sometimes situations that don't follow exactly within this flow, but this should give you a good idea of what is involved in engaging in a project that involves controlled unclassified information for a federal agency. And so this concludes our prepared part of the presentation. We'll now take any additional audience questions. If there are none, we are also happy to answer any questions you have by email. Reach out to us at exportcontrol@utdallas.edu, or you can give us a call at the phone numbers that are posted here on the slide. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Connor. Thanks, Evangeline. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure if anyone has any additional questions, please throw them in the chat now and I will read them aloud just to ensure our recording can hear the questions as well. I see a few people typing. So before we get to those questions, I do just want to underscore, and I believe Connor will agree with me here, that if you have any questions, if you're unsure about anything, the first thing to do and throughout the entire process is to just contact our ethics office with Connor, Evangeline, Lily here as well. They will guide you through the entire process. So the only thing that you could do wrong is not telling them to start. Well, that's not true. However, just get them involved right away. And I think that it will benefit you, your research, and the university as well. We have a thanks in the chat. If there's not any other questions, I'll give it about 20 more seconds and I will close us out here today. If our ethics team has any last comments, now is your chance as well.
I just want to say that I know it seems like a lot, but it is manageable. We do have a lot of existing documentation and growing experience with these kinds of projects to where we can guide you through it. It does take a while, but it is doable.
All right. Do we have any more questions? Speak now. All right. Well, to our entire ethics team, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing this information to our audience and anyone watching on the recording. Thank you as well. We do have a final installment of the Research Security Series, Managing Research Guests, and that is on March 27th. So please stay tuned for that one as well. And then I am going to just take over the screen very briefly for our audience here and our members. We do have a survey that we'd love you all to just fill out. If this webinar was useful for you, was helpful for you, and anything that we can do differently in the future, go ahead and I'll just leave this up till the end of our presentation here. Go ahead and scan that or just go to the link utd.link/CUI survey to go ahead and fill out any information you want to share with us about your experience for the webinar today.